Okay, hello everyone, and welcome back. Welcome to week 6 of the Leadership Alliance Professional Development Series. I'm sure you all know my name by now, but if not, my name is Dr. Taiese Bingham-Hickman. I'm the Executive Director of the Leadership Alliance, and I will be moderating today's event. This event is a component of the Leadership Alliance Virtual Professional Development Series. The Executive Office and its partners created this initiative to ensure continuity of skill building, networking, and exposure to graduate student programs for undergraduate and graduate students from across the country. Paired with our Wednesday workshop evening work series, we hope to expose you to a discussion of critical issues that allow you to network with one another and our wonderful doctoral scholars, as well as to develop learning approaches and skills for navigating your research careers. This evening, I'm pleased to introduce doctoral scholar, Dr. Tiffany Joseph. Dr. Tiffany D. Joseph is an associate professor and graduate program director of sociology and international affairs at Northeastern University. She participated in the Leadership Alliance SR-EIP program at Brown University in the summer of 2003 and credits that opportunity with cementing her decision to pursue graduate studies. After completing her Ph.D. in sociology at the University of Michigan, she was a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Health Policy Scholar at Harvard University and began her career as an assistant professor of sociology at Stony Brook University from 2013 through 2018. Her research and teaching interests explore race, ethnicity, and migration in the Americas, the influence of immigration on the social construction of race in the US, immigrants' health and healthcare access, immigration and health policy, and the experiences of faculty of color in academia. Her book project, tentatively titled Not All in Race, Immigration, and Healthcare Exclusion in the Age of Obamacare, explores how documentation status, race, and ethnicity influence the healthcare access and utilization of immigrants across the US after comprehensive health reform. She has received grants and awards from the Ford Foundation, Institute for Citizens and Scholars, Institute for International Education Fulbright Program, Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowship Program, National Institutes of Health, National Science Foundation, and Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. She is the author of Race on the Move, Brazilian Migrants and the Global Reconstruction of Race, and her work has been published in various peer-reviewed journals and national media outlets. Originally from Memphis, Tennessee, Dr. Joseph is also a graduate of Phillips Academy, Andover, and Brown University. So thank you, Dr. Joseph, and welcome. We're so excited to have you. And before we jump into student questions, if you'd like to share a little bit more about your personal journey and your background, that would be great.
Sure. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Taiese, and to the rest of your staff and colleagues at the Leadership Alliance for inviting me to be a part of this doctoral scholar conversation. As you mentioned in the bio, I am an alum of the Leadership Alliance Summer Research Early Identification Program, and I always welcome opportunities to try to give back where I can by either coming back to the summer conference to, present in panels or interact with students, and also opportunities like these. So it's really an honor to be here to speak with you and the larger community of summer research participants and others who are on this Zoom meeting today. So in terms of my background, I just thought I'd talk a little bit about kind of how I got to this point in my career. And for me, all of that or much of that started when I was an undergraduate at Brown University. So my research interest in race, immigration, and those other areas that Dr. Bingham-Hickman mentioned pretty much stem from classes that I took as an undergraduate at Brown, which propelled me to start to think about issues like the social construction of race in a more, not only in the context of the United States, but also internationally, to start to think about how the process of people moving across borders changes the ways that people think about and navigate race. And I'll talk a little bit about my study abroad experience being really key and influential in that. But also really starting to think about these connections between what happens in individual people's lives and these larger social structures that are a part of our society, laws and policies that govern, our country, that govern, in terms of thinking about global civil society and what have you, that really shape the way people live and experience their lives. And so I really became fascinated with that from taking classes in sociology, and ethnic studies and Africana studies, a range of other disciplines as well, but I would say that those were really some of the key areas of study that really got me thinking about these issues. And I decided I ended up majoring, or at Brown, we say concentrating in sociology, because I felt that a lot of what I saw happening in the world at that time in the early 2000s, and really trying to understand sort of the connection between the individual and the larger society, really, I felt like sociology provided a way for me to think about answering those questions. And in one of my classes as an undergrad, one of the sociology professors said that people who study sociology tend to sort of see something wrong with the world and want to do something about that to try to change it. And so for me, I've always sort of thought of sociology as kind of a vehicle to really be able to think about understanding different types of social and structural inequality and how to use research for the purpose of doing my part to try to work to dismantle it. And so for me, the work that I do as a sociologist is rooted in that. And in addition to my undergrad experiences at Brown, I was a part of the Mellon Mays undergraduate fellowship program, which really allowed me to have access to research opportunities, and to be able to collaborate with and interact with other undergraduates at Brown and also at other universities that have Mellon programs in terms of thinking about how research is really important for trying to tackle some of the major problems that we're seeing in the world today in various fields. And also in terms of, increasing the amount of diversity within academia, which I still feel like is very lacking, although these pipeline programs have really played an important role in shaping that pipeline. I certainly had very few professors of color in college when I was an undergraduate. And even as a professor now, I'm still very aware and cognizant of the fact that a number of the students that I have in the classroom, that I might be the only Black professor that they have in the course of their college career. And so those are things that really sort of drive me in terms of thinking about the research that I do, but also the impact that I have in the classroom with students, having students work on research projects with me, if you will. I mentioned that I worked on the leadership, or that I was in a Leadership Alliance program in the summer of 2003. And at that time, I was working with a professor who's no longer at Brown, but her name was Joy James, and she was working on a book project looking at political prisoners in the United States and how race had really played a role in shaping those people being incarcerated in the United States. And so again, that project was really influential for me for a couple of reasons. One, it exposed me or helped me to really think about sort of in terms of thinking about the context of when people are in prison for having political beliefs, where they are running counter to the system and trying to change the system, and how that's one of the consequences, unfortunately, sometimes that happens. And so it really helped me to kind of understand how unequal society is, that something like that happens, that people are in prison for their particular political beliefs within the context of the United States. And a lot of that has been around sort of the fight for racial justice, if you will. And then that project was also influential for me too, because it really gave me a sense of really starting to think about the process of publishing books, which at that time seemed like such a foreign concept to me as an undergraduate student, in terms of thinking about how the process comes together. For that particular project, it was an edited volume. So I was working with Professor James to contact the different contributors, many of them who had been political prisoners themselves, to try to work on this compilation. And so it really sort of taught me about sort of the nitty gritty around thinking about the book publication process, which, I've now published one book. I have a second book that's in the pipeline. And so it really kind of gave me a sense of sort of one of the ways in which academics kind of get their knowledge out there into the world. And so that was a really pivotal experience for me in terms of thinking about the research experience and how that translates into the publication of a book or broader knowledge that other people in the society, students, other scholars, other people in general have access to in terms of learning about. And so, in terms of thinking about the development of my research interests as well, I would also say that another pivotal class for me was a course that I took with an Africana Studies professor at Brown named Anani Jijenyu, who passed away, I think maybe just a couple of years ago. But he had a course called Blacks in Latin America. And for me, that was a really pivotal course because as a Black American, I'm originally from the South. I identify as African American. And up to that point, most of my knowledge of Black people in general was the African American experience. And so that class was really pivotal because it really helped me understand the role of colonization and the impact that it had on the Americas and sort of the dispersion, if you will, of the African diaspora throughout the Americas, and how the social construction of race in the US ended up developing so differently from the way it developed in countries like Brazil and the Dominican Republic. And so that class was really, really influential to me. And in college, I was also taking Spanish, and I decided to go study abroad for a semester in the Dominican Republic. And that semester was really informative for me because it allowed me to really be able to connect these issues of race that I'd been thinking about as an undergraduate with what I'd learned in Professor Jijenyu's class about these different histories around race, slavery, indigenous conquest, and if you will, in different parts of the Americas, and how that sort of the reality of that took place within the Dominican Republic, and particularly the conflicted history between the Dominican Republic and Haiti, and how I often, as a Black American, looking at other Dominicans and Haitians, I thought, well, we're all Black, so what is the problem here, if you will? But I also learned too, in terms of thinking about sort of the different histories of colonialism within the Dominican Republic and Haiti, how that had an impact on shaping the relationship between those two countries and sort of the conflict and notions of whiteness and European culture being more dominant in the Dominican Republic and less dominant in Haiti as a result of the Haitian Revolution. And for me, I really got interested in these issues of race more transnationally when I was having a conversation with some Dominicans, and somehow in that conversation, I mentioned that I identified as Black, and the Dominicans, who were similar in skin tone to me, were just sort of like, you're not Black, you're a morena, which is a word for people who have racially mixed ancestry or maybe medium to light brown skin tone. And to me, it was just eye-opening because that was the first time in my life as an African American I had ever been told that I was not Black. And so that really got me thinking about, well, this must be what it's like for Dominicans who get off the plane in New York and people are like, oh, you're Black. And they're like, no, I'm Dominican. So it really got me thinking about how you can actually get on a plane, go to another country, and based on your physical features, be in a completely different racial category than you would be in the United States. And so that really helped me start to understand how race really is a social construction and how the movement of people across borders can really transform these ideals and the ways that we think about the categories that get associated with the physical features that people have. And that became the interest of my focus when I went to graduate school. I was really interested in studying and learning more about this issue of race transnationally. I'd become really interested in the case of Brazil because for so long it had been thought to be a racial paradise where there'd been a long history of racial mixing, where after slavery ended there or was abolished, or I should say ended, there was no equivalent of Jim Crow legal segregation as there was in the United States. And so that had led people in Brazil and around the world to sort of see Brazil as this model. And after having been in the Dominican Republic and taken the various classes that I had in college, I was just very skeptical that any place on earth could be a racial paradise. And so I knew that when I went to graduate school at the University of Michigan, that I wanted to study some aspect of race in the US and compare it to some aspect of race in Brazil. And that was sort of, I knew that would become the focus of my dissertation research. So I started learning Portuguese. I started connecting with researchers on campus at the University of Michigan, Brazilian researchers and faculty members. And I was telling them about my interests, and they mentioned that there is this small town in Brazil that's the largest immigrant sending city to the US from Brazil. And that a number of people after living in the US, they go back to that city. And I thought it would be really interesting to talk to those people about their ideas of race and how those change as a result of moving back and forth between these two countries that have often been thought of as racial polar opposites, if you will. And that became my dissertation project, which eventually became my first book, Race on the Move, Brazilian Migrants and the Global Reconstruction of Race. And so in graduate school, I was trained in both qualitative and quantitative research methods. So qualitative methods means that basically I interview people or look at pre-existing textual data, do archival research, those sorts of things to basically gather data, the data that I use for my research. And quantitative methods means things like using surveys or large groups of data, or large pieces of data that you can put into a software and be able to kind of assess different patterns across larger groups of people. Whereas qualitative data, typically, because it's so much more in depth, since you're talking to people and you're trying to analyze words from people, typically qualitative research is done among smaller groups. And so those were the research areas of training that I had in terms of methodology. And a lot of my work has tended to be qualitative because I've really been interested in populations that are harder to find or are harder to reach, populations that are either underrepresented in the United States, or in terms of thinking about surveys, the ways that questions are asked about race or about documentation status. It's not easy to effectively be able to capture or recruit people from certain populations. And so that's really played a role again in the sort of research that I've done. So I'm going to try to get ready to wrap up soon and talk a little bit about the trajectory of my shift into getting interested in health-related research. When I did my doctoral dissertation research in Brazil and the city of Governador Valadares in the state of Minas Gerais, a number of the returned migrants that I interviewed kept talking about kept talking about health. The issue of health kept coming up in my interviews. And I was not asking them about health because that was not the focus of the project. I was asking people a range of questions about how they thought about race, experiences of discrimination in the US and Brazil, how they racially classified themselves using Brazilian categories, US racial categories. But the issue of health kept coming up over and over again, with people saying things like, when I lived in the United States, I didn't have access to health care, or, I was sick all the time, or my diet changed because I was working so much, I didn't have time to properly eat. So I was eating a lot of fast food and I ended up picking up weight. Or I was depressed and dealing with all of these issues. And so some of the people that I interviewed even talked about how they came back or made the return migration to Brazil sooner than anticipated because they had poorer health and they felt that they had better access to healthcare in Brazil than they did when they were in the United States. And that really stuck with me. It really got me to thinking about the connection between documentation status and healthcare access. And so by the time that I started my postdoc at Harvard with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which is one of the preeminent foundations that funds a lot of major health research in the United States, the Affordable Care Act had just been implemented. I knew I was going to be based in the Boston area where health reform had been implemented in the state that became the model for the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare. And there was also a sizable Brazilian population in the Boston area, as well as other Latin American immigrants from El Salvador, from the Dominican Republic, from a number of other Latin American countries that tend to be understudied in research on race, immigration, and health. And I thought, well, this would be a key opportunity in time to really look at that issue. And so that became the focus of my next research project, really trying to understand the relationship between documentation status, how these different groups are racialized differently in the United States, even though they're under this quote unquote Latino, Latinx, Latin American immigrant label, which is a very heterogeneous, diverse category in terms of the way people look, but how that leads to them having having differential experiences with the healthcare system in terms of how race and anti-immigrant sentiment plays out within policy and also within the healthcare system and just interpersonal interactions that people have. And so I guess I'll get ready to stop there and open up for questions, but I just wanted to kind of give an overall, a little bit of background kind of on sort of where I was, when I was an undergrad and participated in the Leadership Alliance program and sort of how I kind of got to this point in my career in terms of thinking about some of the major research interests that I've had and that kind of propel me forward in terms of thinking about what I do.
Thank you. That's quite the pathway, and very interesting how you made that transition. And I think your experience abroad really shaped probably how you ended up pursuing the disciplines that you were interested in, and shaped your thesis. So I guess it's not a question that came up, but one of the things that's I'm curious about is how your work as a graduate student, or even your work currently in your career, how you can relate that to current events as it pertains to immigration and all of the challenges that we're facing now in the United States, and what your thoughts are on that.
Absolutely. I feel like all of my research interests are directly related to what we are experiencing in the country right now. And a number of the classes that I teach as a professor are on these topics too. And so when I'm in the classroom with students, in terms of reading content for the courses, I'm not only drawing on scholarly peer-reviewed research, but I'm also including things from, the New York Times or, the Huffington Post, these various outlets as different events are happening. Because for me as a professor, my goal is to really try to help students be able to make a connection between the content around, let's say, sociological theories of race and inequality and exclusion, and how that ties to what's happening in the larger society, and then having students be able to think about, well, how is this playing out in my life? So that for me, that's something that's really, really important. I would certainly say that, the issue of immigration has really been huge in my research, and really that intersection with race, particularly because I feel like within the discipline of sociology and probably the social sciences in general, and maybe even the humanities as well, that a lot of the research that's been done on those topics has often been done separately, in terms of establishing the important impact that race has had on the United States in terms of shaping social outcomes and immigrants, and how documentation status has played a role. But in terms of thinking about the intersection between those two things, given the demographics of today's immigrant populations and how the majority of them are people of color, with backgrounds or coming from Latin America, from Asia, from Africa, from the Caribbean, these are populations of people that are coming to the United States with the history that the United States has around race. And a lot of there hasn't been as much detail or attention paid to, well, how does that really shape people's experiences as immigrants in this country? How does being racialized as a person of color in the context of the United States, where race has shaped immigration policies since the foundation of the nation, shaped who could immigrate to the United States, actually banned groups of people from being able to migrate to the United States. This has been going on for centuries. Race has been really important, but the subject of immigration has also been a very important part of US history. And so in my work, particularly my current project looking at immigrants' healthcare access and how race plays a role, the ways that these different groups of Latin American immigrants that I interviewed are racialized, I see it playing out in the media so much in terms of thinking about, what recently happened at the border with the treatment of Haitian migrants, who were disparaged and, physically assaulted essentially by Border Patrol agents on horseback, or, children put in cages, at the border. And how, that really, in terms of thinking about our national psyche, those things are really shaping people's lives. And a lot of what's at the root of that is policies that are still on the books or that were recently put on the books that are shaping the treatment of immigrants, of people of color, that continues to do that into the present. And this has significant health implications in terms of when we think about still living in the COVID pandemic, unfortunately. And a lot of what I found in terms of the populations, the communities that I did research with for this book in the Boston area, those communities were some of the hardest hit by COVID. In Boston, in the state of Massachusetts, where most people have access to healthcare, we have world-class hospitals. The income level and education level of people in Massachusetts is much higher compared to other states. So all of these things are working for people that live in the Commonwealth, yet the most vulnerable among us, the most marginalized, are the communities that were hit the hardest by this. And my research shows that, things like documentation status, limited English proficiency, confusion about eligibility for particular public benefits, concerns about when I go, am I going to be pulled over by the police, and could that lead to me being deported? So all of these things really sort of intersecting with each other to shape a number of the social outcomes that we're seeing in a wide range of areas in terms of healthcare access, educational opportunities, where people are able to live, the types of jobs that people are able to get, and how this current again, this history remains with us in the present, the history of exclusion in the United States that's very closely tied to race, to immigration, documentation status, continues to be with us in the present and continues to drive a number of the disparities that we're seeing.
Yeah, and I guess building upon that, based on, all of the various scenarios and examples that you've laid out, one of the questions that came in from one of the students is whether or not you've had the opportunity to apply your academic knowledge to impact change within healthcare policy. So how, if you have, how have you done that? Or if you have plans to do that, what are you currently working on?
So, in terms of thinking about sort of how my work is translated to thinking about policy, one of the ways that I've really worked to do that is, when there have been opportunities at the state level in Massachusetts, because the seat of government is in Boston, at least before COVID, when there were public hearings on different proposed legislation that was going up, I would go and testify at some of those and use my research to do that, to at least try to influence, sort of what was happening at the state level in Massachusetts, and sort of show examples from my research about why this particular policy proposal that's being put forth is a good idea or why it's not. And so that's one way that I try to do that. Whenever there's, certainly in the last couple of years, when there have been opportunities for public comment on certain policies. So for instance, at the federal level, or I guess I should say maybe executive orders, when it was announced that the Trump administration was going to try to change the public charge ruling, which basically would make it more difficult for individuals from lower income backgrounds to be able to immigrate to the United States, or, in terms of applying for green cards to be able to come to the United States. I would write public comments and do that. I'm hoping that, since I've also been spending a lot of time working on this book, I'm hoping that now that the results, I finished writing the book and it's in the production kind of pipeline now, I'm really hoping that that will allow, me to be able to get this research into the hands of the people, at larger levels of government that are making these choices that do shape eligibility for certain types of benefits, but also to think about the role that structural racism, how it's so entrenched in our policy making process, and how even though things or policies appear to be race neutral, they often have racialized implications, where people of color particularly Black, Latinx, Indigenous communities tend to disproportionately be negatively impacted by some of these policy implications. I'm hoping that my research will sort of show we really need to be thinking about the ways that we're making policy differently, the way that we're implementing policies. We shouldn't assume that everyone is fluent or proficient in English when it's time to apply for public benefits, or that everyone has the necessary documents to be able to proof of residence or proof of income. How those are things that really make it difficult sometimes for certain populations to be able to apply for benefits or services from the government that they're eligible for, but they can't because they can't produce all of the sort of information that is being required for people to do that. And so those are, I guess I would say, are probably a couple of ways that, I have been engaged in that work, and how I hope to be more engaged in the future, particularly when the book gets closer to coming out and people can actually read it. I do include some policy recommendations that I hope legislators at various levels of government will be able to read and take into account, so that we can hopefully address some of these disparities that I've been talking about.
Thank you. And what would you suggest for students who are looking to become more involved in social change, or, participating in activism? How should they get involved?
Sure. I think that there are a few ways that students can do this. So I think, first and foremost, if you're able to take classes on some of these issues and just get informed about what the issues are and sort of learn sort of the history and the background around a number of these issues, I think that's really, really important, because I feel like one of the biggest barriers to change in this country is that we just simply don't know our history. And when I say history, I mean sort of thinking about our collective history, not just, let's say, what was taught in elementary school, but I feel like a lot of the not so pretty parts of our history are often glossed over. And we certainly see sort of attacks or attempts to sort of sanitize the history of this country without effectively paying attention to how we got to this point. And I feel like it'll be very difficult to address issues of racism, sexism, various types of isms, various types of social inequality, if we don't effectively know what it is we are trying to address. And it's hard to do that if you don't know the background and you don't know the history and sort of what got to that point. So I think that's one of the most important things people can do to just educate and to educate themselves and become more informed about what's going on. I also think that the next step is taking that information, and if there are organizations, in your community that, are working on those issues, get involved with those organizations, volunteer, spend time with them. A part of the work that I've been doing, or the research project I worked on, I was actually interviewing, not only did I interview different immigrant communities, but I interviewed healthcare providers and employees from a range of immigrant and health advocacy organizations. And in order to be able to gain the trust of those community organizations, I would volunteer at those organizations. If there were events at the State House and those people from those organizations needed translators, since I speak Spanish and Portuguese, I would be there. If there were citizenship application clinics, or when I first started this project, DACA had just been implemented, I was working at these organizations, helping people fill out applications. And so I was on the ground in the communities with these organizations, trying to use the skills and the privilege that I've gained and background that I've gained from my research to help empower these communities and to help people get access to opportunities that they've been excluded from. So trying to use the knowledge that I had to share it with those communities to help them empower themselves. So whatever your particular, I guess, area of interest is, in terms of an activism, whether it be around immigrants' rights or Black Lives Matter or, LGBTQ rights, and in the context of, what recently happened with the Dobbs case at the Supreme Court, reproductive abortion rights, find ways to get involved, to get informed and to get involved and to figure out how you can, become a part of, creating the world that you want to see or to be a part of. So I would say those are probably two, two big areas. And then I guess another way too is if you have the resources, donate your resources to these organizations, which oftentimes, particularly community organizations, are often underfunded. And so you'll be surprised at how much, $50 here, $100 there means to some of these organizations, if you're really passionate about the work that they do. So and then I guess I would just say lastly, vote, register to vote, not just in presidential elections, but be informed about what's happening at the subnational levels of government, city, county, state level, all of those. Being involved in the political process is really important. And one of the ways to do that is voting. Of course, that means in certain states around the country now, you've got extra barriers to do that. But it's important, wherever the policies are around registering, submitting ballots, learn what they are, try to do it ahead of time so that you can beat whatever deadlines there are, given the types of sort of more restrictive voting measures that we've seen, which, are also playing a role in affecting the effectiveness of our democracy here in the United States.
Thank you. And I want to ask a little bit about, some of the awards and foundations that you've been a awardee of. I noticed in reading your bio, there were several. So for the students out there that are listening, how did you come across those opportunities? Was it, your work in the community that kind of informed you about certain opportunities or certain networks, connections that you made along the way? Can you talk a little bit about how you came across those opportunities and what you did to put yourself in a competitive position?
Sure. So a lot of it was probably, or some of it I would say was through networks. So in graduate school, at the department that I was a graduate student in at the University of Michigan, there was a big focus on, encouraging students to apply for external funding. And so at the graduate school level, particularly in the social sciences, that meant pre-doctoral fellowships like from the National Science Foundation, the Ford Foundation. There are other sort of funding opportunities as well, at the pre-doctoral and at different levels of graduate school. And so I was, even though I was fully funded or came in with 5 years of funding into my PhD program, the culture in my department at the University of Michigan was, you need to start to get into the practice of applying for things. And so even though it was fully funded, I was just sort of like, well, maybe I should be applying for some of these fellowships because that's the message that I'm getting. And so, I was really fortunate to receive a Ford Foundation pre-doctoral fellowship, which in addition to, 3 years of funding in graduate school, also has this large network, sort of like the Leadership Alliance or the Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowship Program, this huge network of Ford Fellows who've been awarded these fellowships at the pre-doctoral, dissertation, and postdoctoral level, which as a person of color, as a Black woman in academia, being able to go to the annual conference and connect with Ford Fellows of various disciplines at various stages of the academic pipeline was just really crucial for me because it helped to be able to see those examples, right? Examples of, deans who were Ford Fellows, full professors, people who made it through the pipeline. And to me, getting initiated or being fortunate to receive one of those fellowships as a graduate student put me in that network, which I just feel like was so important. And particularly because at graduate school, or I would say at each step of being in the academic pipeline, I was often one of the few or the only Black people, Black women in my department. And that's still the case as a faculty member. And so being a part of these larger networks is a reminder that, there are a lot of us out here, even though I might sometimes feel isolated in my particular particular institution or in department, there is a network of people working on similar research interests who are passionate about these particular topics, who are trying to navigate the tenure track when they are the only or one of the few, in their particular department or program. And so it really helped that in terms of thinking about other opportunities. Think in terms of other opportunities, one of the things about once you get like a competitive fellowship, once you have that on your CV, that helps you get other things in terms of if you have that on your record and you're applying for additional funding, when reviewers are looking at your records, they're like, okay, this person had a Ford, this person had a Fulbright, that means that, they are, in terms of their research, what they're proposing, that their work has been vouched for by other sort of elite, prestigious institutions. And so those are the things that actually allow you to kind of get additional opportunities. And so I feel like in my particular case, that was sort of what happened. I would find or learn about particular opportunities that seemed like it was a good fit for maybe the research that I was working on or the stage that I was in my career. And I would apply for things. But I mean, that's another conversation in terms of applying for competitive funding. And I do a workshop on that with my graduate students and give advice about these things, because now that I've won a lot of grants and fellowships and things, I've also been a reviewer. So from both sides of this, I sort of know what it takes to kind of be successful at grant writing or applying for fellowships. But I would say it's probably a mix of networking. And then also too, it just means, it takes time to apply for these opportunities. You might not get them the first time, but a lot of these opportunities, they will provide feedback, and you take that feedback and use it to reapply. And so that's something that I've done with some of these opportunities, that the first time around, I didn't get them, but I did the second or the third time. And so I think the other thing to remember too is sort of perseverance, and also preparation. A lot of these opportunities have deadlines, and they're firm deadlines. So, you want to try to begin preparing your materials for them as early as you can, and have your mentors, faculty members, people that you trust, their opinion you trust, to sort of give you feedback on those materials as you are preparing them. It's not something that you write your first draft and you're like, okay, I'm going to submit this to the NSF Graduate Research Fellowship Program. Usually you're not going to be successful doing it that way. So that would be what I would say. Learning about these opportunities for networks. And then some institutions too, also, or universities, like on their library webpage, have search engines for grants and funding opportunities as well too, where you can also find out about lesser known grants and opportunities as well that might not be as competitive. But, if you need money to do research, that money, if it's coming from a less competitive opportunity, could also work in your favor too. So I'll stop there.
That's great. And I'm happy to hear that you do a workshop on funding, because that's one of the things we want to add for next year for this series, and potentially for lands as well. So we'll definitely be in touch about that. And yeah, I would echo what you mentioned, and also add that conferences are also a great way to learn about funding opportunities. I know myself, I learned about a few at Abercrombs, when I used to attend, and, I ended up applying for and receiving the McNair Award and the Mark U Star. I was part of that program. And all of those opportunities I came across either, by doing summer internships or attending conferences. So I think that's a great way to learn about them. And I think that's a good segue for you to talk about your experience as a Brown SR-EIP participant, and also your experience at Lands, because we have Lands coming up next week. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So, yeah, I was just thinking, it's 2022 and it's been almost 20 years, which I just realized since I did participate in the program, which is just so hard to believe. But when I participated in the program at Brown, I remember that we definitely, would have like the weekly opportunities where there would be guest speakers who would come in. And then just sort of other professional development opportunities, that were happening or that were organized for us, in addition to, um, our individual research assignments or the faculty member that we were working with. And so I felt like those opportunities are really, really helpful for me, not only in terms of the research piece, but also in being able to connect with, again, fellow participants from different colleges around the country, the speakers, the external speakers, who would come in and talk to us about their different types of research. Was really, really useful. And I really like the interdisciplinary aspect of, the program, and also the Lands Conference, just because I feel like so often within academia, people have tunnel vision in terms of their research interests. And it's really hard for people to think about the research areas that they have or the questions they have from a broader perspective. And I think for me, having exposure to, the Brown SR-EIP program, the national conference, being a Mellon Fellow, all of these things were really, really important in terms of starting to think about my work, not only as a sociologist, but trying to think about it from other lenses as well. And also how to be able to communicate and talk about my research in a way that other groups of people, who aren't sociologists, who aren't social scientists, can understand what it is that I'm doing. So I felt like I started to develop those skills, at, the SR-EIP program at Brown, and since that time, because, we were living in the dorms, again, in terms of thinking about sort of the social experience of the program too, living in the dorms, doing social activities as well. And, people, oh, what did you do in your lab today? Or what project are you working on? And, I thought it was just so fascinating. It's like, wow, that student, or, that colleague of mine in the program is working, on biomedical research with a renowned doctor, medical doctor, medical doctor, Ph.D, M.D, and so I was just really impressed by just sort of the level of research and engagement that students were participating in the program and their areas of expertise and sort of how it developed over the course of the program. And in terms of thinking about the Lands Conference, it was sort of like the SR-EIP program, on a much larger scale, because it was like everyone coming together from the different campuses. And again, providing another opportunity to be able to network with, think about all these different research topics that students were working on, and just being and really impressed by the caliber of the presentations that students would have by the end of the summer. I mean, I was really impressed as an undergrad seeing what people produce within their time in the program. But even since I've come back as an alum to the meetings, I've just been continually impressed by it. Like, wow, these are undergraduate students working on this kind of research. Like, it's just amazing. And so I would say, in terms of thinking about advice for the Lands Conference, I think when I was a participant, we would get like the business cards that were provided for us with our names and emails and contact information, and encouraged to hand that information out, or those cards out, definitely as you meet people and talk to them about their research interests, about your research interests, as you meet some of the graduate school program representatives. I think some of the representatives for some of the different programs that I've referenced, like the Ford fellowships programs, or and others, I think I remember I've seen some of them there over the years. So, use that as an opportunity to really kind of start to get your name out there and your research interest, and starting to make an impression, on other people there, because you just never know where that might take you 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now. And so I still think back, to that. Again, it's been almost 20 years, but I still think back to my Lands experience, and I still feel like there is so much that I gained from that has remained with me now in terms of professional development, public speaking skills, self-presentational skills, all of those things that are just so crucial, for those of you who want to go into academia, or even if you want to go into industry, you got to be able to do pitches and presentations about, the projects that you're working on. And so starting to develop those skills, are really important. And I think Lands really allows you the opportunity to be able to do that.
Thank you. And they'll definitely be able to use those skills in action. We still do the business card. So it's a great opportunity for you to network. And like Dr. Joseph mentioned, we will have the recruiting fair with most of the schools that are part of the Leadership Alliance. Will be there talking about their programs. So that will be a great opportunity for you to learn more. So I did want to ask, because it was in your bio and I'm curious. I saw that you also attended Phillips Academy, which is a very prestigious private school, and it's for high school. And wondering how you came across that opportunity and why you decided to go there.
Sure. No, sure. So I found out about Andover, I guess, which is the nickname for Phillips Academy. I guess probably when I was in, maybe I want to say sixth grade. I went to a public school in Memphis, and it was one of the, oops, hold on a second. But I found out about it in the sixth grade. I went to a public school in Memphis, which was a school for quote unquote smart kids, if you will. And so Andover recruited there every year. And so one of my guidance counselors, I guess I would just say I've always been very intellectually curious about the world. So from a very young age, I just always was very interested in learning and knowledge. And now that I'm a sociologist, I realize that I was tracked from the time I was in like kindergarten, which I didn't realize at the time. And I'm sure my parents didn't either, but in terms of the opportunities or the types of schools that I was in, that sort of led to other opportunities for me in terms of education. But one of my guidance counselors, because I did really well in school and didn't think I was necessarily being as academically challenged, even though I was at this school for really smart kids. She was just like, yeah, the representative from Andover and Exeter and a couple of other schools are going to be coming, to give admissions presentations. And I thought, maybe you would want to check that out. And at the time I was thinking, that just sounds crazy to me. Why would I leave home at age 14 to go 2,000 miles away to go to school? But at any rate, when I went to the admissions presentation for Andover, I was just blown away in terms of the way the school was presented, in terms of sort of the educational opportunities that were available. And the opportunity to really get this experience of, experience what life potentially would be like as a college student, but as a high school student, because it was a boarding school, and that meant I would be living in a dormitory with students from all over the world. Everything was on campus, world-class teachers, who had advanced degrees, and just sort of access to like the best sort of technological resources and facilities and campus facilities, that one could have access to. And so I, applied my 8th grade year for entry in the 9th grade, and I was admitted. And I'm from a middle class family, so there's no way I could have attended Andover without financial aid. So I'm very thankful for the financial aid package that I received. Now Andover has completely need blind admissions, which I'm really happy about in terms of contributing to, having more financial or socioeconomic diversity on campus. But for me, being at Andover was really eye-opening because, up to that point, I was only or primarily around other African Americans. I grew up in a middle-class African American neighborhood in Memphis. And so going to Andover, I became a minority, coming to New England, I definitely had a stronger Southern accent at that time. It kind of comes and goes now. The weather was different. And again, I, became one of the few, and so that's something that I think that experience at Andover kind of prepared me for being in environments where I am the only or one of the few, whether it's a woman of color, Black woman, from the South or what have you. Um, And so, yeah, that's how I got to Andover. And I would say that my experiences there really, even though I didn't realize it at the time, when I look back now, I feel like the seeds of being a sociologist were planted there, because as I would be at Andover and then go home over breaks and sort of think about, wow, this is the opportunity, the education that I have access to. And then, my friends at home who were going to different types of schools, or seeing, sort of the differences between the experience I had access to and what they had access to. But also being in an environment where there were students who were from incredibly wealthy backgrounds, who were multi-generational families at Andover. And I was, the first in my family to attend an institution like that. It really helped me start to think about, again, social structures and the history of this country, and sort of how, that manifests itself into the types of opportunities that people have access to based on race, social class, or what have you. And so that was planting the seeds for, the coursework that I would take at Brown that would pivot me into becoming a sociologist. So that's my Andover, briefly my Andover, I guess, Andover story, and how I got from there to here, if you will.
That's very interesting. I'm from Massachusetts, so I'm familiar with the school, and I know it's one of the top high schools in the nation. So I was curious about that. And I also have a similar experience. Well, I'm also from a middle class family, but from Massachusetts, from a very diverse town. And so I had the opposite experience, where I actually, for undergraduate, I went to an HBCU. I went to University of Maryland, Eastern Shore. So that was like my first time being around all African Americans all of the time. And so I think the lesson there for, from both of our experiences is definitely try new things. Take yourself out of your comfort zone. You never know. You may think, I don't like that place. Why would I ever go there? It's not something I'm familiar with, but those are really the experiences that shape you, and really provide you with, other opportunities that you wouldn't otherwise come across. So I would say, take the leap, definitely go out there and try and experience new things, and, definitely make those connections, make those networks that Dr. Joseph talked about. So we only have a few minutes left, so I just want to ask Dr. Joseph if you have any final words or thoughts for our students, and also, if there are other questions that we didn't get to, Samantha will post Dr. Joseph's information in the Google Classroom, so you'll get a chance to follow up with her. But Dr. Joseph, would you like to close us out for today with parting words or thoughts?
Sure. I guess I would just say, in the time that you have left in the SR-EIP program, on your respective campuses or wherever you are, to really just try to think about how whatever opportunities you have access to try to make the most of them, to try to learn and gain as much as you can from them, not only in terms of professionally, in terms of knowledge and skills, but also in terms of, how to interact with people. How to think about cultivating relationships, with individuals, in terms of thinking about the work that you do, making the connections in terms of, potentially this could be someone who's a collaborator with you, in the near future or the distant future, because I feel like academia is pretty small. And it's been amazing to me to sort of think about, at this stage in my career, having come through or been a part of a number of these different pipeline programs. And then it's just sort of like, wow, I know that person. They just got a MacArthur Genius Award, or they just did that, in terms of thinking about, it's like, I knew that person when, and so, it's just, I think it's really important to be able to think about how to cultivate those relationships, because particularly if you do decide to, go to graduate school, go into academia, you will start to see, some of these names kind of come up over and over again, particularly within your area of interest or your field. And so, to the extent that you're able to think about how do you cultivate relationships, these can be very important for you in ways that you might not even recognize. I just think it's really important to think about making the most of the opportunities that you have before you. Um, it's not always going to be an easy road. Certainly, there were times when I was in graduate school where I kind of felt like, you know what, I don't know if this is for me, or, close to the end of graduate school. I was questioning whether I wanted to pursue a career in academia, and it's okay to have those doubts, or to have those questions. But when you have those doubts and have those questions, I tell people to try to kind of think back to what was the inspiration that propelled you in that direction in the first place. And so for me, at the root of that was a desire to, again, use sociology as my craft, to try to work to dismantle the social inequality that I saw in the world in various areas. And so that was kind of what grounded me, having that foundation. And so I encourage you to try to kind of think about, what is your inspiration? What is it that is going to ground you, that you're passionate about, that's going to help you get through the really difficult times ahead that might come when you're finishing up your undergraduate degree, or when you're in graduate school finishing up that PhD or that master's degree. When you are, in academia or in industry and you confront difficulties and adversity, try to think back to kind of what propelled me here, and rely on that to really help you get through those difficult times. Because I find that that's been something that's really been helpful to me, to have that motivating sort of place to come back to. And then surround yourself with, important and solid support system too, of people, who can lift you up when you need it, in terms of family, other people in your program, in your department, in your institution, if you will, because, we can't do this alone. It really does take a village. And so those would be my parting words. And I would just say, don't give up, and, keep going down the road, and keep it, again, don't give up, and, continue to find that inspiration that you need, or come back to that inspiration to kind of help you persevere and to keep you going.
Well, thank you, Dr. Joseph, for sharing all of your experiences and your insight. It was, great to have you, learning about your work. We'd love to have you back again. So we will be back in touch. But again, thank you so much. And if you'd like to share your information with the students, I know we had a few questions come in the chat, and there were a bunch more we didn't get to. So we're happy to follow up with those students and get you in touch with them. So thank you so much, and
right.
we'll see you soon.
All right. Thank you all so much. I really enjoyed the opportunity to be a part of this. And good luck with the last of your summer and lands that's coming up.
Thank you.